You're listening to Sports Connections with David Smale, the show that brings you a fun and intimate look into connections throughout sports. Now here's your host, David Smale.
Bob Herzog spent his entire professional career in the newspaper industry, primarily at Newsday, one of the nation's largest daily newspapers. He was there for 42 years. As a native New Yorker, he helped tell millions of New Yorkers about the successes and failures of the Mets and Yankees. He's a lifelong Yankees fan, so we had many fun discussions when, as a Royals fan, I worked under Bob in the early 1980s. He's well-versed in all sports, but his first love is baseball, so we'll focus mostly on that. For those of us who are fans of small market teams, Bob's opinions may not be popular, but I can tell you firsthand that they will be well-developed and well-defendable. Bob, welcome to Sports Connections.
Hey, Dave, it's a pleasure to be here.
All right. As I said, you were at Newsday for 42 years, and you spent 46 years in the newspaper industry. We could probably take the whole hour with the answer to this question, but how did the industry change in all of those years?
Yeah, we could. I even jotted down a few things so I wouldn't forget. But I would say that the biggest changes were in the technology, and that starts with I started out with a typewriter that I don't even know if some of your readers know what that is. And that's how I typed the stories in college, in my first jobs at Newsday. So that was the first thing. Then we came to computers to edit and output, and old-fashioned, cumbersome computers the writers would take to the stadiums. And of course, that evolved into laptops, and then that made transmission easier, editing easier. But then the next big stage from that was the internet. Huge change, changed the way every bit of the business goes about editors, writers, broadcasters, researchers, everything, you, me. And then finally, technologically, at least, the huge change was social media. Totally changes how you go about your job. You have to be involved. You have to be on social media. You have to follow players and general managers and other writers. So those changes were dramatic. And in the sports world itself, many changes. Women and minorities, greater opportunities. Many would argue still not there yet, but certainly a lot of changes from I started in 1972, not 1872. So there were changes, but it's still an issue today, as we all know, the reality of Black Lives Matter and other things involving the women and equal pay and equal opportunities and equal access. So those changes were dramatic. Things like Title IX and legislation changed, women's sports changed. March Madness exploded when I love college basketball. And when I started and when I was first rooting in college in my first job, 16 teams in the tournament. Now there's 68. And March Madness, I don't even know if that phrase existed actually. So, and now it's sort of part of the general population, March Madness for everything.
Yeah.
So there's that. And then I think the other thing that I wanted to note was football in 1972. The 70s were when football exploded, I think, and became the national pastime, but it was still sort of on the bubble at early 70s. But I got to Newsday in 76, it was starting to change, and then football became more popular than baseball. Wasn't that way when I grew up. So I would say those are gigantic changes in many cases, but I've seen a lot.
One of the things that you mentioned, I want to touch on specifically because it affects how journalists do their job, and that's social media. With Twitter and things like that, you not only have to be accurate and timely and all that, you have to be first. And sometimes some journalists will sacrifice the quality for the scoop to the detriment of the reader, the follower, because what they're tweeting or what they're releasing hasn't been verified. Just talk about how, and I know you were a writer and an editor, so you did all those things. Just talk about how the need for urgency has sacrificed the desire for quality.
It's a really important point, and I hammer it home in my classes. And I sincerely hope that students of Professor Zog don't put being first ahead of being right. And maybe to my detriment, to use your words, sometimes I would rather be right than be first. And sometimes I got scooped because I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to go with it until I knew for sure. It's definitely changed it. As an editor, I didn't like editing. The writers were just putting stuff out there on Twitter, mostly blogging. The great Neil Best, our media columnist, likes to say Twitter is for news, Facebook is for family. So tried to separate it. That would have posted a big story on Facebook, but mostly Twitter, and that's what my company wanted. Yes, indeed, it's an important consideration. So of course, in the perfect world, you're like Agent and the other guy who that from the NBA who's great on scoops, and then you have Ken Rosenthal and Jason Stark. Verducci, of all people, Tom doesn't do social media, but they are good at being first and right.
Yeah, that's a special skill.
But that's not always true. That's of course what you strive for. But I think it's part of society's change too. People do want this information right away. They're not content to wait. If you asked about changes, there's a big change. When I was a kid, I was a paper boy. I delivered Newsday. It was an afternoon paper. Those don't even exist anymore. And, when I was a writer early on, we didn't have a website. And so it was the next morning when your story was coming out. If you had a scoop, you held your breath because you didn't know if somebody else was going to have that. Now you'd know within 5 minutes, and there's no more sitting on stories.
Right.
You used to sit on it to make sure the first edition was out. You didn't want to give the competition a chance by putting it in your early edition, so you sat on it. We sat on stories in the early days on the website, not to put it out there, because print wasn't coming out for several hours. Now, the heck with that. It's get it out there first. So definitely increase the pace of the business. And it's more demanding on the writers. I mean, you're on call in some ways 24/7, different time zones, and especially when there's big news expected, changes, coaching changes, trades, bowl bids, all sorts of things, announcements. People go to social media to get the links to what they want before they go to any other medium.
And what we're talking about now with this question is just the print version of the newspaper. Can that industry survive? It's on thin ice right now, isn't it?
Yes. My feeling is, and of course I'm biased because I did it it was my life, and I believe it will survive in some form, but I can't, it would be naive and probably foolish to say that there's always going to be print, but I do think there was always going to be newspapers. They're just going to be, maybe it'll be online. When the technology is such, and we're getting there to where everybody, rich or poor, urban or suburban, rural or cities, can get access. And now with the phones, you can get access. So I know I preach to my class that the writing is always going to be important. The writing and the reporting and the breaking of news, I believe, will always be important. Where the platform is what has changed and may continue to change. And, I don't think it will be in my lifetime, which I hope has some more time to go, that we'll see the complete elimination of newspapers, but slowly the websites of those newspapers are getting more priority. It's true at Newsday too. We still cared about the print edition, but in many cases, the website is more important. And in the beginning, I used to joke that the tail was wagging the dog, but now it is the dog.
Yeah.
So, getting, the website is a high priority, and getting stories on there. And, it used to be web only copy had a stigma attached to it. Now it doesn't. So I can see some changes. I could see newspapers having more of an online presence because of the costs of having a building and the cost of printing. So yes, thin ice is definitely an apt description, but I'm not ready to write the obituary just yet, but where you'll get your newspaper news from, I admit that may change, but I still think someone's got to break the news, someone's got to write the news, someone's got to edit the news, and someone's got to produce it, put it out there. So I feel like there's still a chance, still an opportunity.
Okay. Before we leave the newspaper side of our conversation, I just want to hit one more thing. I've been able to catch up with a few of my former cohorts at Newsday through the years. Some of them started as part-time high school reporters like I did. Wally Matthews, who was with the New York Post for a while, covering the Yankees, columnist. Damian Cristodero was a columnist for a paper in Tampa. And you already mentioned Tom Verducci, who came to Newsday, if I remember correctly, as right out of college, played baseball at Penn State and hit the ground running with Newsday. Who else do you remember getting their career bump, either their start like I did or the boost with Newsday? Any of those old names?
Yeah, I got one good one for you. Is Rich Cimini. He's still the Jets beat reporter for ESPN. I hired him. I hired Verducci. I hired Cimini. Hired Ken Rosenthal as an intern at Newsday. I had a good run of when I was in a position of hiring in my management days. So Cimini, we hired to cover high schools right out of Syracuse. And in a couple of years, he advanced to the Jets beat. And he's been on it for more than 30 years. He is the senior most beat writer in the country for any team. But he's changed from the Newsday to the Daily News, now to ESPN. And he's also changed platforms. He does a lot of stuff for ESPN, not just the website, but on TV too.
Right.
So, but Wally is definitely got to start as a part-timer, and I hired him. And Verducci was a summer intern, and then we made a wise decision to hire him after that.
Yeah.
So that's at least three. There's others. Peter King, but he didn't start at Newsday, but his profile grew enormously at Newsday when he covered pro football. But I'd say there's quite a few went on to do other things, and some made Newsday a destination because it still is one of the larger papers.
Sure. I don't know if you remember the details when you hired me, but I was not even a year out of college and had just moved back to New York, and Newsday ran the bracket. The Selection Sunday wasn't publicized. It wasn't on TV. And so I opened up the paper the next late morning. It was kind of morphing from an afternoon to a morning paper, but I opened the paper the next day. And if I remember correctly, it was North Carolina and Memphis, who were both number one seeds, were playing each other in the first bracket you guys ran. And being bashful, I called the sports department and ended up talking to you. And I said, your bracket's wrong. And you said, well, it came across the wire wrong. And we corrected it in later versions. And I said, you need someone who looks at the wire copy and makes sure it's accurate before giving it to the editor. Can I have a job? And that was on a Monday, and I started on Thursday. So I was bashful. I held back a lot, but you saw something in me, and I appreciate that very much.
Well, wouldn't be the first time that we made a mistake. So.
All right. Well,
glad you caught it.
Let's talk about the main purpose or the main thing I want to talk to you about. I see you are wearing a Yankees tie today. Before we started recording today, you mentioned that as a journalist, you couldn't let your fandom be known while you were doing your job. But everyone who knew you personally knew that you were a Yankees fan. When you were breaking into the business, especially as when you broke into Newsday, I think the Yankees' biggest rival was probably the Royals. How did Yankee fans look at the Royals at that time?
I gave that some thought when you had emailed me the questions, and I have to say that I don't actually think that the Royals were the Yankees' biggest rivals, except in October for those 3 years in a row, and then in '80 when the Royals finally broke through and won. And the reason I say it is that the Yankee Red Sox rivalry had
Right.
been dormant for a long time, but starting in 75, Munson Fisk, 76, famous brawl, and then two incredible pennant races in 77. And even though those years were Yankees Royals in the playoffs, I think that the Royals was more like an October rivalry and not the kind of lasting, deep-seated rivalry that the Red Sox had. Now, if the Red Sox hadn't emerged at the time, it's possible that the Royals would have been a fiercer rival. But to be honest, I would say I'm not going to be snobby and say that they were dismissive of the Royals,
Right.
but the too many years of history before my time too. Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio, those teams were big rivalries.
Right.
Then when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, the Red Sox weren't that good, but I knew about how good they were. And it wasn't that many years removed from DiMaggio Williams that my dad told me about. So I knew about it, but then it came to the surface in the mid 70s, right at the time Yankees Royals. So that was to me more like a flash in October. But I think what did make it heated and it built was that there were 3 years in a row.
Yeah.
And the first 2 years went to a game 5 and epic rival, epic series. And I think that for Royals fans, frustration that all 3 times you lost, twice the Yankees went on to the World Series. And of course, then in 80, when Yankee fans were sort of shrugging, say, well, we'll just take care of the Royals again. In fact, they didn't. And that was a team that won 103 games under a familiar face to Royals fans, Dick Hauser,
Right.
who was a Kansas City Rookie of the Year with the Athletics. Then I think Brett had 3 home runs in a game in that series and took Gossage deep in a big game in a big spot. And then the Royals won, and then that's it. There really hasn't been any. I don't think the rivalry has endured. But for those years, it was intense, and those series were really intense. And but I don't I don't feel it was as deep seated and as the Yankees Red Sox, which coincided with that rivalry heating up.
Yeah, and I think you're certainly right. That was the peak of it, the mid 70s through 1980. In fact, I think one reason the Royals didn't win the 1980 World Series is they had already accomplished everything they wanted to with a 3-game sweep of the Yankees in 1980. It was like, oh, we have to play again. It was almost like that was the barrier that they were completely focused on. And so I remember the 80 series much better than I remember 76, 77, and 78. But
I don't. Isn't that fun?
I'm sure that there are certainly some things in those 3 years, though. Guys get suspended for 10 games for charging the mound and challenging the guy's manhood. There was a play at third base, and I think it was in 77. It was in Kansas City, and Brett slid in hard to Greg Nettles at third base, and Nettles pushed him, and they were duking it out, and they were throwing punches, and the umps separated, the benches cleared, the umps separated everybody, and they both stayed in the game. That was baseball.
I jotted that down because you asked me why it became a rivalry, and it was that thing. And of course, you see it now every time I turn somewhere showing a clip of Hal McRae taking out Willie Randolph on a double play. Weren't even angry words. I mean, it was fierce. Now you'd be ejected if there wasn't a brawl before that. Yeah. You're not allowed to do it. I mean, he's legendary for how hard he slid in and his rolling blocks. But there's one clear play in the playoff, which I think was 77, when he took Randolph out clean, but so hard, completely flipped him. And, Randolph didn't even try to get out and get out alive. They both teams played hard.
Yes. And
the Royals had some really competitive, hard-nosed players. And I think you had Billy Martin and Whitey to me, but you had 2 intense managers, not afraid to retaliate or to play that brand. And I think that Billy commented about Larry Gura. He had a famous comment, kind of a soft tossing lefty who had been a Yankee briefly before he had success with the Royals. And the Yankees had trouble with left-handers. starters then. And so the eared and said, I'll send a limo to pick him up and bring him to the ballpark. That's how little afraid he was of Larry Gura. So I think comments like that and personalities like Brett and Nettles and McRae, besides the fact that they were two good teams,
right?
There was some flamboyance, some character. You had Reggie. I think if you were to ask me a memory, I think one of my biggest memories, this Chambliss' homer, but really was Reggie getting benched in a game 5. I wrote about that not too long ago. I did something on Reggie, and it's incredible to think that a superstar would get benched against a lefty by a manager who didn't really respect him, never really wanted him in the first place, but he got benched for game 5. You think by accident he might run into one, you wouldn't take the chance of benching him. And sure enough, he wound up pinch hitting, and Splitoff was the lefty, and he got a single. It wasn't a rocket, but he got a single that set up an important run when the Yankees came back to tie it and win in extra innings. And that part of the Mr. October mystique. But I mean, Reggie Jackson was benched in game 5, a win or go home scenario, the highest profile player on either team. He was benched for a game 5.
Yeah.
Even Torrey didn't bench A-Rod. He batted him 8th, but he didn't bench him.
Yeah.
So that's what I remember. That's one of the things I remember most about those series.
You talked about some of the characters. I don't think baseball has the characters now like they used to. They're so marketed, they're so polished and everything. One of the last Yankees Royals thing I want to ask you about didn't really have anything to do with the rivalry, but it had to do with the characters, and that was the Pine Tar game. People around here think of the Pine Tar game and think of George going crazy and his famous statement. At least I'm not known for having hemorrhoids in the 1980 World Series. I'm known for something else. But people remember that as a crowning achievement for the Royals. What is the Yankees fans' perspective of the Pine Tar game?
That's a good one, because that was definitely the Royals getting the last laugh, but also the Yankees were barely clinging to some life in that pennant race, and it was clearly the wrong call was made, whether it was a violation of an inch on the bat with the Pine Tar or not. In the spirit of the game, it had no impact on whether he hit a home run or not.
Right.
So that that was kind of a Pyrrhic victory when they were first declared it, and when Major League Baseball ruled that the home run counted, but the game would have to be finished. Basically, the Yankees were, now suddenly behind and going to have to come back and play. And soon after, they fell out of the race. And I think that was almost like desperation on the Yankees' part. Not that, and it's Billy. It was Billy Martin too. If it was a more calmer manager that kind of tried to do that, if it was somebody more learned like Tony La Russa saying, I don't think that was. No, it's Billy, his defiance, and initially getting the call. Yes, I think that was a good one for Kansas City fans to laugh about and enjoy. You got the last laugh, and it was really a desperate clinging to life kind of scenario for the Yankees. They were slipping in that race and never did get back into it.
In my 40-plus year career as a journalist, I've been able to be at a lot of famous events and things like that. In fact, I'm considering doing a book on the top 10 things that various people who've covered sports have been to. And so I figured I better put together my list. My number one is I was at the Pine Tar game. It was my wife's birthday. And early that spring, I said, what do you want to do for your birthday? And she said, let's see who the Yankees are playing. And I remember saying, who are you? And what have you done with my wife? But
that wouldn't happen here.
No, we went to the game. We were actually sitting next to Gaylord Perry's uncle. And because my uncles represented Gaylord Perry, so that's where we got our tickets. And after Pat Sheridan, who replaced Willie Wilson, made the second out of the inning, he starts gathering his stuff. And I said, where are you going? He said, game's over. I'm going to try and beat the crowd. And I said, don't go anywhere. UL Washington's going to get a base hit. They're going to bring in Gossage, and Brett's going to hit a home run. And so he sat back down. And
he listened to you.
well, yeah, but I thought, man, I've got more influence than I thought. So anyway, Washington gets a base hit. Here comes Billy Martin, points to the bullpen. If you remember the first pitch, Brett hit it out, foul. And it was really close. It was down the left field line, but it was just foul. And Mr. Perry looks at me and I said, hey, my premonition, it looked fair. Well, then he takes a ball and then he hits one out. And it was deathly quiet, except for the four guys sitting in front of us who were from White Plains, who were the brothers of Mike Armstrong, lifelong Yankee fan, who was proved to be the Royals' winning pitcher. And so as Brett's coming down the third base line, Billy Martin is coming out of the dugout. My wife said, what's Billy doing? I said, oh, he's going to complain about something. That's what he does. She said, what's he going to complain about? I said, well, he's probably going to say George has pine tar or has cork in his bat. She said, does he? I said, no, I don't think so. Then they lay the bat down and said, now what does he complain about? I said, well, he's probably going to say George has too much pine tar. She said, does he? And I said, probably. He said, what happens if the ump agrees? And as I say, watch out, McClellan points to the dugout, calls him out, and, all heck breaks loose. And that, I remember that stadium shaking. Literally, we wanted to get out of there so it didn't collapse, because that was the loudest I've been in Yankee Stadium for Red Sox games, and it's loud. I don't ever remember it being louder, and it was only like 25, 30,000 people there.
Yeah, that's another thing that changed in the good years in the late 90s when I was covering. They drew 4 million a couple of times, and routine crowds were.
Okay, let's talk a little bit. I know it's an old story, but I want to give you the chance to state the case for why it's fair. The economics of baseball changed the rivalry, as you mentioned. After 1980, the rivalry pretty much dissipated because the Royals weren't very good. 85, when they were good again, 84 and 85, the Yankees were down, and the rival was Toronto. But a city or a metropolitan area of 10 million plus provides more financial value than a total metro area, 9-county region around Kansas City of just 2 million. Why is it fair that the Yankees have more revenue and don't have to share that with a smaller market team when they're really in business together?
Well, clearly it's not fair, but it's the system that was created. The only sport that completely got that right was the NFL, and that was among the many great things that Pete Rozelle did in his early years, was that he and Art Modell and Wellington Mara got together, and when they decided there was going to be a national TV contract starting in, I think, 1960, and they just decided it was going to be shared equally. The revenue for national TV was going to be shared equally, and that meant a team like Green Bay, a city of 50,000,
right,
was not at an economic disadvantage with the Yankees. And so that move was huge, one of the more significant business of sports moves in history. And then no one else followed that model. And the nature of the sports, national telecasts for football are more common.
Right.
And you probably couldn't do that, but it is unfair. And although they tried to make free agency fair, in that another great maneuver business-wise, Marvin Miller saying everybody can't be a free agent, limiting the number of people that could be free agents, was also important, because if everybody was a free agent, the Yankees, believe it or not, would have had an even greater advantage, because they could have cherry-picked the entire roster. But yes, it's unfair, but at the same time, there's been more than enough evidence that you can't do it the other way, including the Royals as recently as 2015. There's still a smaller mid-market beat the big market team, and there have been other cases. And in fact, the Yankees have not won the World Series since 2009, and they also haven't been in it. So that's a long time. Now they're winning games, they're winning divisions, et cetera. But it's become now, how do you spend your money, not just how much you spent. In the early years of free agency, you could change your team around with a big move, and the Yankees in consecutive years got Reggie and then Gossage, and
right.
I don't think they win those years without him, but they've had plenty of failed signings, and there's still some emphasis on the farm system, especially the way they've changed the rules for how much control of a player you have. And so if you can get some players and keep those early years that they're under control, and that happened with the Royals in 2015, and I don't think a number of those core guys are even still there, or if they're just not as good as they were. Yeah. And so, but you can build and win. I mean, the Marlins have won a couple of World Series. So it's unfair. They've tried to tweak the system. I'm not smart enough to know what's the fairest system. They do share the TV revenue now, which is in the billions,
right?
And that's significant. But some owners feel like they, put that money in their pocket. They don't necessarily put it back into the team. You can say whatever you want about Steinbrenner, but he was actually a good owner.
Yes.
I'm not saying he was necessarily a good, moral, and ethical man, but he was a good owner. He wanted to win, and he put that money back into players. Made some bad decisions, but that there are people now that, because the next generation of Steinbrenners, Hal is still alive. Hank passed away. Hal is running the team, but with some fiscal responsibility.
Yeah.
George didn't have the year that Machado and Harper were both available. Many Yankee fans said, well, we wish George was around. We had had at least one of them, maybe both, and wouldn't have worried about luxury taxes and other things. Of course, we're not sure that that's how he would have reacted there. There wasn't a luxury tax in the early days. So, it's not really fair, but they've done a few things, like with the luxury tax. When you go over, you pay a lot. Yeah. And it also, you pay it going forward, because then they reset your limits, and now you're paying it, the penalty going forward. And now you have teams like the Yankees and the Red Sox and even the Dodgers saying our goal is to get under the cap. And so while getting under a $200 million cap or whatever it is, Royals fans would laugh and say, we've never gotten near that cap.
Yeah.
But the Yankees are probably not going to make a big ticket big ticket signing this offseason, despite a few needs, because of money. So the system is correcting itself a little bit, but other things, it's unfair, but I don't think it can change. Nothing can make the Royals TV market bigger,
right,
to where they can derive more revenue from it. Their stadium is fine. It's a good size. It's a nice stadium. If they're good, they'll pack it. If they're not good, they won't. But the Yankees aren't drawing what they used to either.
Yeah.
But the TV revenue element, that can't be changed. And as far as what's a destination and what isn't, I mean, most of the time guys want to play, but that's what's important to you. But they proved it. That you can build a championship team, even if it's for a short time, in a small market. But
that's great. A great answer. A great way of explaining it. Kansas City fans or small market fans in general, they're not gonna like the fact. But I don't think there's a way to correct it without taking the NFL model, which won't work because the networks don't want to broadcast every game. I want to switch gears a little bit. The Royals-Yankees rivalry is not the first connection in baseball between the two cities. Kansas City was a minor league affiliate for the Yankees when we had the Kansas City Blues, and then 1956 we got the A's, and the A's acted like they were a Yankees affiliate. I don't know how old you were when that was going on, but talk about any recollections you have of saying, "Oh, we could just go get these guys from the A's. These guys are pretty good, even though the team stinks."
I absolutely have recollection, because I'm a baby boomer, so I was born in 1950. So I certainly remember 1959. The Yankees got Hector Lopez. I got to know him later in life because his son was a high school basketball coach of note on Long Island. I covered him, and I got to meet Hector later. But I always teased him that he could have been the original DH, because he wasn't a very good fielder, but he could hit, and he wasn't a very good fielder at a lot of positions. So he was versatile, but he could really hit. But the Yankees got him, and he helped them win a couple of titles, and he was there 5 years, I think. But then the next year they got the blockbuster. They got Roger Maris from Kansas City. And there were a lot of players, Norm Seaburn, Jerry Lumpy, Billy Hunter, many that went back and forth. Hank Bauer went back to Kansas City, I think, in the Maris deal. There was a lot of Norm Seaburn is another one that they were there, then they came back. Art Ditmar, another one. He was there, then he came back, then he got traded back and forth. I think Don Larson went back to Kansas City. If the Yankees needed somebody and the Royals had a promising player, the Yankees made a deal with him. Much of baseball, fans and management of baseball hated that. It was by the rules, but it just seemed like the Kansas City would deal with the Yankees. And, the most important one was Maris.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of others, and Hector Lopez was pretty important. And he was an all-star in Kansas City, didn't become one with the Yankees because he was a role player, and Maris became Maris because of the trade. I think that was Kansas City basically. Even then, it wasn't free agency or anything. But then a player got to a certain level of stardom, and it was likely the the Athletics couldn't afford that player. And eventually, of course, the Athletics became Oakland.
Yeah.
They couldn't keep the franchise there, so, there's some economic realities that, they're not fair. I don't have the solutions, but the Yankees in Kansas City, there is definitely a history and being a farm team that I don't remember, but I'm sure a number of the important players that came up through the system came in there. And I think you lived there. So I would say that the generation before you and maybe two before you, there were Yankee fans in Kansas City.
Absolutely.
Because of that.
Yeah. Big time Yankee fans. My mom still roots for the Yankees, not as much as she used to, but except when they're playing the Royals, because she remembers those days. And, we had Phil Rizzuto, we had Billy Martin, we had, a lot of those guys came through Kansas City on their way up to the Yankees for sure. Speaking of New York baseball, though, did the New York fans have any flashbacks in 2015 when the Royals defeated the Mets? It was popular in Kansas City. Hey, if we can't beat the Cardinals, who's our biggest rival out of the league. We can't beat the Cardinals. We want to beat the Mets because they're New York. How did New York fans react to that?
Interesting. That was another thing I thought about when you told me some of the things we talk about. I have absolutely zero recollection of the Yankees being mentioned once that October. The Mets own the city. Their fans were thrilled to be in the World Series. It validated a lot of moves they'd made. Matt Harvey was, the Dark Knight, and he was a celebrity nationally. And there was nothing about it being a renewal of a New York-Kansas City rivalry. There was nothing about that. I don't even remember any kind of flashback or historic stories about that. I suppose if George Brett had been the manager, I'm sure that they would have, if he was managing the Royals, they would have asked him about that. And I can't remember the Royals staff, if they had anybody, and maybe a Kansas City writer might have picked up on that. But no, the Mets, when the Mets are in the postseason and the Yankees aren't, they own the city for that time, and they don't even want a reference to it. Now, that doesn't stop the media from pursuing the angle it wants to pursue. But honestly, I don't remember any stories about a New York Kansas City renewal. It was the Mets' time to shine. Getting through the playoffs, making the run to the World Series, and that epic decision to leave Harvey in the ninth inning cost the Mets a game and turned the series in Kansas City's favor. Because I think if he pulled the pitcher and Familia maybe had held the lead, I think the Royals might not have won that series. But after that, it went the other way, and even then, it took a throwing error to really help the Royals. The teams were close enough. I think the Mets could have won the series if Terry Collins hadn't trusted and listened to Matt Harvey so much that he clearly was out of gas at that moment, and he left him in.
Yeah, there some evil or some mean Royals fans said that Salvador Perez shouldn't have won the MVP for the Royals. It should have been Familia, because he contributed to all of the wins for the Royals.
There were some blown there. Yes, he did. There were definitely some blown saves. And, I was at, it's a total digression, but I was at opening day in 2005, and they awarded the Red Sox their rings. The Major League Baseball scheduled the Yankees to open in Fenway in 2005, and the Red Sox famously reversed the curse in 2004. And when first of all, Dave Roberts wasn't on the team. They brought him back for that. all he did was pinch run, but it's a big spot. The crowd went nuts.
Yeah.
And then when they introduced the Yankees, there's boo, boo, boo. When Mariano Rivera got introduced, they cheered, they roared for him. It was derisive cheering, but Mariano won them over by tipping his cap and bowing to all corners of the stadium as if to say, you know, and the applause turned into genuine warmth and no more boos and jeering. They were saying there's a guy with class, which he was, by the way, any way you want to slice it. Yeah. But he just basically diffused it. All the other, in fact, Torre was not going to bring him out from the clubhouse to the field for the ring ceremony, saying, let it be for the Red Sox. Yeah. They brought back Bill Russell, Bobby Orr, all sorts of Boston athletic icons. Yaz, they were Boston icons. It was a big deal to be, you know, from 1918 to 2004. Yeah. But then Torre decided for the history of it, he would want to be back and how the fans will react. There was a case of Rivera actually won the fans over with that gesture.
And tying that to 15 and 16, in 2016 was the first time in history that the two teams that played in the previous World Series opened the season at the next year, because it was the first time we had interleague play all the way through the season. And I remember being in the Mets clubhouse after that, talking to some of the players that had been around, saying, what'd you think of the tribute? You know, I wasn't mean enough to ask those questions, but there were a lot of Kansas City reporters that were asking Mets players about seeing the highlights of the previous World Series.
Yeah. Fans look at things differently than the media and then the players and than the players.
Why is it, except when the Mets are really good, why is it that the Yankees are so successful and the Mets are almost an afterthought?
Yeah, it's a question that Met fans probably wonder themselves. I think there are several factors. There's the Yankees' history.
Right.
So when the Mets came into being was in 1962, that was in the middle of what turned out to be the last Yankee dynasty until the mid-70s, which was a smaller dynasty and whatever. But so there was, and baseball hadn't changed its rules yet. They didn't do that till 64 for when you could sign players. And so the Yankees had that magic name and history, and so they could attract players back before there was a draft of high school players and all of that. So that was one thing. Then the Mets became lovable losers for a long time. And then they finally won. The Yankees weren't very good in 69. So, you know, the Mets kind of own the town. It seems like they haven't always been good at the same time. But so that's one thing is history. Then another reason was the Yankee ownership. Quite frankly, Steinbrenner was a good owner. He spent a lot of money and it built on itself. Then free agents felt that was a destination. And the Met owners, even though it was a big market, didn't spend as freely. They tried to develop. They did have a run of developing important players, great pitchers, and but they didn't spend like a big market team. So there was that. Shea Stadium was not a great stadium to play in. If you were a hitter, it was a hard ballpark to hit home runs in. It had deep alleys. And the ball didn't carry the way it did at Yankee Stadium. It wasn't short down the lines. It was pretty deep in center field, especially after, compared to other parks. And it wasn't a great stadium for ambiance the way some of the others were. It was a cookie cutter stadium, just didn't have artificial turf.
Right.
It was perfectly symmetrical, and it was, it could have been, Three Rivers or Riverfront except that it had grass. So it didn't have a lot of atmosphere. It was beloved for Met fans, of course, but it just wasn't necessarily a destination stadium. So I think that was it. And then I think then the Mets ran into an era, the Torre era, the Torre years. The core four came up in the farm system. Those four were legitimately developed, plus Bernie, who I always feel gets the short shrift. It should be a Fab Five and not a core four. Then they had that long run, and in that run, the Mets had a good team in '99. They made it to the World Series in 2000. They had representative teams. They just weren't quite as good, and they have that's a whole stretch where the Yankees were. I mean, that's more than a decade of dominance in the city. So, I mean, there's a lot of factors. It looks like it's going to change a little bit with a a very rich new owner for the Mets, who will spend the way Steinbrenner did and not worry, just shrug off tax implications because he's a multi-billionaire. I believe he's richer than the Steinbrenners. And so we'll see. But there's the buzz in New York is that he'll sign Springer, and he might sign, he's already signed a catcher, McCann. I mean, maybe he'll even sign Bauer. There's just that he'll spend more freely and not have the restraints that the Yankees appear to be under, relatively speaking. It's certainly not what Kansas City would consider restraints.
Right.
But so that could change. I mean, Met fans really, really would love it. They're craving a chance to overtake the Yankees, but they've only had brief moments. They never seem to have a long run. 69, They were great, but then they're not in the playoffs again. They had the little magic in 73, then they're gone. 86, it's one of the great teams in baseball history. If you look back, 108 wins. And it took a little luck to win the World Series against the Red Sox, but they get it. And then you have your two best players and stars, Strawberry and Gooden, have unfortunate issues with drugs and alcohol. And so they're still good, but they never be fulfilled Hall of Fame promise. And so they're not even, they lose action. They miss action, and they're not even in the playoffs in 87. And then they get stunned by the Dodgers in 88. So they didn't even have a long run of excellence with that team that you said, oh, this is a 10-year run. Didn't happen.
Real quickly, talk about 2000 when both teams were in the World Series. Was it 60-40 in favor of the Yanks? Was it 50-50? What was the split of attention and fandom?
I think it just reflected how it regularly is. And I don't know whether New York is a 50-50 town or not. Older people remember the Dodgers and Giants being there. So the Mets get some of that, but those people have passed on. I think it's probably New York is probably closer to 60-40. I don't think it's a 50-50 split. No one switched sides then. It was pretty intense. But that was a weird series because it's 20 years later and you look back and if you're not informed, you say, oh, the Yankees won in 5 games, 4-1. Every game was close.
Yeah.
The biggest margin was, 2 runs or something in a game. They were all close. The easiest win the Yankees had was actually turned out to be a 1-run game. I think they had a 5-1 lead, and then Jay Pitt plays. Everyone's leaving. It was 5-1 or 6-2, whatever it was. So that was a misleading 5-game series. All the games were close. You see Piazza's drive to center field. Many people thought that was a game-tying homer. It died at the track, and Bernie caught it. So, but that series, as you know, if you lived in, a shrug. It was big in New York. The ratings were not great around the country. Yeah. The games were close. You'd think it would have meant good theater. There was a lot of good theater. There was the Piazza Clemens thing, and Jeter leading off a game with a home run. There's some good stuff happening. That was very dramatic with the Yankees rallying in the ninth on Luis Sojo's just dinky ground ball that got through everybody. But it didn't seem to catch on anywhere else. It was a big deal in New York.
Yeah,
tough. It was a tough series for newspapermen. All the games started late. Took for bad early editions that had very little of the game in it.
And then who do you if you've got a Yankees beat writer and a Mets beat writer, who writes the game story? I mean, those are questions that most cities don't have to think about.
Yeah, in fact, we took a neutral party. We had Mark Herman write the game story because he's an eloquent writer, and let the 2 beat guys each do an intense locker room story, analysis, whatever. Then we had columnists, and we had sidebar guys like me. We had probably 6 to 8 at every game. It's just what, including columnists, but because of the deadlines, it was a lot of frustration on the good stuff getting in like a day late. And the off days had the best stuff because a day late when another game was played, it almost became outdated. Yeah. So that's inside journalism stuff. It was a tough series to work.
Sure.
Deadline.
We'll wrap up with this. I'll let you put on your commissioner's hat and you're Rob Manfred for a day. How do you return baseball to being the national pastime?
Boy, I wish I knew. I'm not sure if it can happen. I think football benefited. It's the perfect sport for television. It's once a week. Well, it's not once a week anymore.
Right.
It's Monday and Thursday, and so it's 3 times a week, and day and night Sunday. It's changed, but it's just kind of a day off, kind of in front of the TV thing that baseball isn't. It's just incredibly popular because of television. That's what made football. I don't know if we can turn back the clock and change that. Baseball's tried to do some things. Obviously they aren't getting as many minority players. Minority players are playing other sports, the NBA and football. The stadiums are good. Some of the new stadiums are really great. I personally would like to see them move the starting times up. They've done it a little bit. I think it's a shame that generations of kids don't get to see the World Series. It starts too late. The games are at night, postseason. Can't you play the weekend games during the day? It's the World Series. People will find it. They're worried about prime time, and it's all about money. Everything's driven by money, TV revenue, prime time. That's why the games start later. I understand all that, but so short term, you don't charge as much. You can't, because advertisers won't pay for a 2:00 start or a 4:00 start or whatever. But long term, you might get more viewers. There's just so much about baseball that isn't kid friendly, in my opinion. The games start late; they take a long time. And there's a few rule changes. Some of the rule changes that came out of that short season, I'd like to see. Some of them are stupid, like putting a runner on second base in extra innings goes against the grain, in my opinion. And you can't limit how many times you throw to first. You just can't. Otherwise, you're giving the base runner who steals a huge advantage. But some of the other things are okay with me. I'm even okay with seven inning games for double headers. I know that sounds blasphemous. I think there should be a universal DH. I think fans, they can say they want to see strategy, but no one pays to see the double switch, a National League thing. You pay to watch people hit. I'd rather see a DH. Even the 3-batter minimum, I don't know. It didn't really have a great effect on shortening the game, but there's so many changes. Relief pitchers changed the game. Now the rosters, you got 13 pitchers and 12 players on a lot of rosters. And then the one that I definitely am in favor of is the shift. To me, the game was designed a certain way, and I feel like they should ban or adjust the shift. Maybe build the stadiums, cut a little more grass out of the outfield so the infielders can play a little deeper. But once they set on how much, I would say an infielder can't play in the outfield. That would be my rule. Other sports have rules on how you can line up. Football has rules. You can't have certain formations. I would do that. I think that the shift hasn't really helped the game. It's helped teams win in a certain way, but other things we can't change. If players want to try for home runs by doing a launch angle thing, that you can't change. That's somebody being ahead of the curve and understanding that this is a way to do it. A home run is never a bad thing. I get that. And I think it was revealing what Theo Epstein said when he's taken a year off, it looks like. And he said that he helped with the things that are hurting the game a little bit. So many relief pitchers and the emphasis on the, walk, strikeout, home run, the 3 true outcomes and launch angle. And he had players that were like that. And he built the team around analytics. I don't think analytics are a great thing. Don't get me started on WAR and other stats, but I can't say it hasn't worked for certain teams, but I think it's kind of ruined some of the charm of the game. I don't think every kid really understands what WAR is. Adults don't. It's not a stat you can put up on the scoreboard or on the screen or see in the paper. And it's a vague stat that isn't really compiled till the season is over. And I'm not a big fan of those kinds of stats, the projected stats. I like the real stats. The more of them, the better. I'm fine with on-base percentage and other things, but WHIP, those are all real stats. I'm okay with those. But some of the others, I think it loses a portion of the audience. But I don't have like a single great solution. I do want to see them go to a universal DH. That seems like an easy switch. But other things people might object to. But others love the game. But I understand why some people don't. They like it but don't love it, or they like another sport better.
Let's put together an effort to change one thing the World Series games are all daytime games. I remember going to school and sitting here in class with my transistor radio with the little cord plugged into my ear, listening to the game. That brought a whole generation. Yeah, they'd lose a little bit in ad revenue, but they would gain so many more fans. How about if you and I work together on getting that one changed?
I would love to see it. I mean, I remember literally running home from school, from the elementary school, if you could, running home. The games, the World Series started at 2:00 school. And I also remember, to show you how popular baseball was then, they would wheel in on a cart a black and white TV into the classrooms at 2:00 because my fifth grade teacher wanted to see the games. They would put it on, and I still, honest to God, I remember this, second or third grade. It's either was Miss Izzo or Mrs. Katz. I'm not sure which one. They do it. They wheel the TV in. God bless them, but neither of them knew anything about baseball. They're trying to keep the class together, and I'm essentially holding court. It was the Yankees and the Braves, so it was either 57 or 58. And I am telling oh yeah, it's Hank Aaron and it's Eddie Matthews and it's a Mick and it's a good matchup and it's this and that. And I'm telling them, and the teacher goes something like, Robert, would you care to share with the class? The way teachers do.
Yes.
And I said, well, yes, I would. And I started to tell the class about this stuff. And, everyone's laughing, thinking I'm going to get in trouble. But the teacher was actually kind of impressed because she had no idea that a second grader or a third grader could tell them about who was in it and what was going on. They were kind of indifferent. But the point being, okay, I was a wise guy. But the point being that the game was so popular, they brought in the TV.
Yeah.
The only other time we did that was when Alan Shepard was the first astronaut. I vividly remember them bringing that in. So it was a 15-minute kind of flight. He didn't even go into orbit, and they made a big deal about that. It's a different time. The World Series was a big deal.
Yeah.
It's not quite as big a deal now. And I don't know if we can get that back. There's other sports. The NBA has its moments of being as popular as anything. Internationally, it's more popular than baseball. So I don't know. I think there are a few things, though, that could make it a little bit more appealing and reach out to the kids. I don't think baseball's done a great job with that.
All right. Well, Bob, I have enjoyed this immensely. It was good to catch up with you. Good to renew the conversation about the Royals and the Yankees. And I still very much appreciate you taking my call in the spring of 1982 and taking a chance on somebody with no history, but letting me work for you for 2 years. And I loved it. And it's great to catch up with you.
Same here. It was a pleasure, Dave. Thanks so much. And good luck with your projects. I'll be keeping an eye out for your next book.
Thanks for listening to Sports Connections with David Smale. Make sure to subscribe, follow, and rate the show from your favorite podcast platform. You can learn more about David Smale and his work by visiting davidsmalebooks.com. Don't forget to join us weekly for new episodes. Until next time.